Chapters 27 and 28 of Napoleon and Josephine, The Rise of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 27. 1809. Return of the Emperor. The Emperor reached Fontainebleau on his return from Vienna at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 26th October. He had traveled with such rapidity that he arrived a day sooner than he was expected, and found no one to receive him except the concierge. To pass away the time he inspected the new apartments in the château, which he had had furnished with great magnificence. A little later Cambacérès appeared, in advance of the other courtiers. The failure of the Empress to meet him, which was in no way her fault, seemed to have put Napoleon in a very bad humor, and he openly declared to the Arch Chancellor his fixed intention of repudiating Josephine, and espousing either a Russian or an Austrian princess. Cambacérès, who was devoted to the Empress, ventured some timid and respectful remonstrances, but he was immediately silenced. At this time Napoleon was truly the spoilt child of fortune. More absolute and more imperious than ever, he no longer allowed even a suggestion from his family or his ministers. Every one obeyed and kept silent. In the words of M. Thiers, his all-powerful nature had completely blossomed out, and it was to fade away like his fortune, for nothing stands still. Next came Fouché, and the wily Minister of Police was not slow to take advantage of the Emperor's feeling to make an indirect attack on the absent Josephine. "There is not one of your marshals," he said, "who is not considering how to dispose of your estate if we have the misfortune to lose you. It is a case of Alexander's lieutenants eager for their kingdoms." After these conversations with his ministers, the Emperor went to his library and began to write. Late in the afternoon he heard the noise of a carriage arriving in the court and rushed downstairs. But it was not the Empress, and he returned to his work. An hour later Josephine finally arrived. She had made all possible haste to come from St. Cloud as soon as she was informed of the return of the Emperor. Seeing that Napoleon did not come to meet her, with a heavy heart she mounted the stairway, and entered the library, where she found Napoleon seated at his writing table. "Ah, there you are at last!" he exclaimed. "You did well to come, for I was about to leave for St. Cloud." At this brutal welcome after a separation of 6 months, the eyes of Josephine filled with tears, and she swayed as though she were about to fall. Napoleon at once relented, took her in his arms, and tenderly embraced her. Josephine then went to her apartment to change her toilette for dinner. An hour and a half later she reappeared, resplendent in a new gown which became her marvelously. To avoid the embarrassment of a tête-à-tête meal, the Emperor invited 2 of his ministers who were working with him to dine with them. Forgetting his bad humor, he showed himself quite amiable. But the evening was not to end without another rude shock to Josephine. On going to her rooms for the night, she discovered for the first time that, during the recent alterations to the château, the inner door which communicated with the Emperor's suite had been closed. This was a significant fact which she did not fail to appreciate. She did not dare to ask the Emperor for an explanation, but the next morning she questioned M. de Beausset, the Prefect of the Palace. He professed his ignorance of the change, and Josephine said, "You may be sure that there is some mystery attached to it." To a woman of her intelligence, however, there was very little mystery about the matter. She fully understood that the divorce was now only a question of days. Yet when they left Fontainebleau for Paris on the 14th of November, the Emperor had not spoken, and Josephine again began to hope against hope. At Paris there was soon a regular assembly of crowned heads. The King of Saxony was already there, and a few days later there arrived the Kings of Naples, Westphalia, and Holland, and the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine. Ségur, the Grand Master of the ceremonies, had difficulty in finding suitable quarters for so many exalted personages, and complained that he was troubled by an embarras de roi. It was surely an irony of fate that the imperial court had never been so brilliant and so attractive as when the gracious Josephine was about to leave it forever. Napoleon, usually so prompt to put his plans into execution, did not seem to be able to make up his mind to sever finally the tie which bound him to the woman who for 14 years had been associated with his destiny, and who recalled the most brilliant days of his youth and his glory. M. de Beausset draws this sketch of Josephine at the time of the divorce. The Empress was 46 years old, No woman could have more grace of manner and bearing. Her eyes were enchanting, her smile full of charm, her voice of extreme softness, her form noble, supple, perfect. Her toilette, always elegant and in perfect taste, made her appear much younger than she really was. But all this was as nothing beside the goodness of her heart. Her spirit was amiable, never did she wound the self-love of any one, never had she anything disagreeable to say. Her disposition was always even and placid. Devoted to Napoleon, she communicated to him without his perceiving it her kindness and goodness. A still more intimate observer, Mademoiselle Avrillon, gives us another view of Josephine at this same time. She says: "The Empress, constantly in tears, endeavored to hide them from the persons around her; but it did not take a very discerning eye to perceive that her happiness was destroyed forever, for she lived in a state of continual agitation. It is really impossible for me to say whether she was rendered more unhappy by the blow she received than by all the preliminaries of the event itself; as, notwithstanding the conviction of her future, she still preserved, if not hope, at least a vague feeling of uncertainty, every time that a minister or a grand dignitary of the Empire came to see her, she pressed him with indirect questions, tormented equally by the desire to know her fate and the fear to learn it." Finally, on the last day of November, Napoleon found the courage to break the fatal news. "What a scene for a tragedy!" he said himself in speaking later of the events of that evening at the Tuileries. Josephine dined alone with the Emperor in a room adjoining his chamber on the first floor. She wore a large white hat which partly concealed her face. Not a word was spoken, and neither of them touched the courses which were placed before them, and then silently removed. After dinner they went into the salon on the other side of the palace, between the throne room and the gallery of Diana. After a moment of silence, Napoleon began to speak. He said that the safety of the Empire demanded a momentous resolution, and that he counted on all of her courage and devotion to consent to a step upon which he himself, with the greatest reluctance, had decided: the dissolution of their marriage. Josephine made no reply. She burst into tears, and then fell, apparently in a dead faint, upon the floor. Greatly agitated, the Emperor opened the door of the salon and called Monsieur de Beausset, who was on duty that evening. After closing the door, Napoleon asked the Prefect if he was strong enough to lift the Empress and carry her by the interior staircase to her apartment on the ground floor. Beausset, a large stout man, took Josephine in his arms, and followed Napoleon, who led the way, holding a candle in his hand. When the staircase was reached, Beausset said that it was too narrow for him to descend with such a burden. The Emperor thereupon called an attendant, gave him the candle, and told him to light the way. Then he relieved Beausset of the Empress's legs, allowing him to support her body. In this manner the descent was begun, Napoleon walking backwards, and Beausset following, supporting Josephine with his arms around her waist, and her head resting on his shoulder. Suddenly he heard her voice whispering to him softly: "Take care. You hurt me. You are holding me too tight." The descent was finished without other incidents, and Josephine, still in a swoon, was placed upon a sofa, and her maids called. The Emperor then left her in their care, and withdrew from the room, with his eyes filled with tears, and every sign of the deepest agitation. It would be difficult to believe this little episode of the stairway, if the story were not related by such a devoted servant of the Empress as Monsieur de Beausset. If there is anything certain in this world, it is that Napoleon, from the first, always loved Josephine, with a devotion which far exceeded her attachment for him, and that he continued to love her until his life's end. Yet history will never forgive him for finally allowing his duty to the Empire to overcome his affections. It is easy to condemn his action as heartless, or as dictated by ambition, but nothing is gained by calling names. If it were not for the fantastic connection which has been imagined between the fortunes of Napoleon and the "guiding star of his life," we should not have heard so much in condemnation of his divorce, which certainly was dictated by the most powerful reasons of state. The case is not altered by the fact that his second marriage was a dismal failure; or, as he himself once expressed it, that the Austrian alliance was "an abyss covered with flowers." It is a striking instance of the shortness of human foresight that a step taken to assure the safety of the Empire was to be the principal cause of its fall. In his trouble after this trying scene with Josephine, Napoleon opened up his heart to Beausset. In a voice broken by emotion, he said, "The interests of France and of my dynasty have forced my heart. The divorce has become for me a rigorous duty. I am all the more afflicted by the scene which I have just had with Josephine, because for 3 days she must have known through Hortense the unfortunate obligation which condemns me to seek a separation from her. I pity her from the bottom of my heart. I thought that she had more character, and I was not prepared for the manifestation of her grief." After each sentence he paused to catch his breath, and displayed every sign of the most poignant emotion. Then he sent for his personal physician, Corvisart, also for Hortense, Fouché, and Cambacérès. Before ascending to his own apartment, he went again to see Josephine, whom he found calm and more resigned. He received the 2 ministers on their arrival, and afterwards had a long talk with Hortense. The interview with the Queen was very painful. He began in a tone of simulated harshness. "My decision is made," he said. "Neither tears nor cries will affect a resolution which has become unavoidable, a resolution absolutely necessary for the safety of the Empire." "Sire," replied Hortense, "you will have neither tears nor cries. The Empress will not fail to submit to your wishes, and to descend from the throne, as she mounted it, by your will. Her children, content to renounce the grandeurs which have not made them happy, will willingly consecrate their lives to consoling the best and most tender of mothers." "That cannot be!" cried Napoleon, much moved by her words. "Such an action would raise the suspicion of a veiled misunderstanding, either on your part towards me, or on my part towards your mother and her family." "In our exile," continued Hortense, "we shall never forget all that we owe to the Emperor." "Ah! You will abandon me!" cried the Emperor, bursting into tears. You to whom I have been a father! No, you cannot do that. You will remain with me. The future of your children demands it. No matter how great for us all is this cruel sacrifice, it must be carried out with the dignity imposed by circumstances." The Emperor then outlined to Hortense his plans for Josephine's future: palaces, châteaux, a magnificent income, the first rank after the reigning Empress. Everything possible was to be done to dissemble the change in her situation which would result from the divorce. He then sent Hortense to see her mother, and try to reconcile her. The night which followed was one of the saddest in the life of Napoleon. Several times he arose and descended to inform himself personally of the condition of Josephine. He did not sleep at all. In the morning, when Mademoiselle Aversion came, Josephine called to her to approach the bed, and told her confidentially what had occurred. Seeing her air of consternation, Josephine at once began to excuse the Emperor, saying, "He is in despair over our separation. He also cried, and assured me that it was the greatest sacrifice he could make for France. Yes, I well know that he must have an heir for his glory, a child who will consolidate his empire. He has told Hortense that he will always be the same for her and Eugène, and that he will often come to me in my retreat. He has sworn that he will never compel me to leave France. He allows me to live at Malmaison. He wishes me always to enjoy a position of consideration, and that I shall have an adequate income." At that time there were no daily papers such as we have to day, all eager for news. But the journals would not have ventured to publish the reports even if rumors of the coming event had leaked out. The secret seems to have been well kept by the few persons who knew it, and the Empress appeared as usual at several functions during the first 2 weeks of December. At the fête of this trying fortnight Napoleon was in public even more attentive to Josephine than usual. On the first day of December the Emperor and Empress went to Malmaison, where a fête was given in honor of the King of Saxony, at which were present the King of Naples, Holland, and Würtemberg, who arrived in Paris that day. An elaborate programme had been arranged to celebrate the double anniversary of the coronation and the victory of Austerlitz, as well as the conclusion of the Treaty of Vienna. The festivals were to be prolonged over several days. On the 3rd, in the morning, there was a Te Deum at Notre Dame; in the afternoon, the formal opening of the Corps Legislatif; and in the evening a state dinner at the Tuileries, On the 4th, in the morning there was a grand review in the court of the Tuileries, and in the evening the Emperor and Empress were present at a fête given at the Hôtel de Ville in honor of the coronation. For this occasion, the court of the Hôtel de Ville had been transformed into an enormous ballroom. The kings and queens danced in the quadrille d'honneur, after which the Emperor traversed the room and addressed a few courteous words to many of the ladies present. On the 7th there was a spectacle at the Tuileries, but this time the Empress did not appear. It was given out that she was suffering from a migraine. Poor Josephine had gone to the limits of her endurance. She was also absent from the side of the Emperor, when on the 8th he received in the throne room a deputation of the Corps Législatif. In his reply to the address the Emperor used a phrase which seemed to presage the coming event. "We shall always know how, my family and myself, to sacrifice even our dearest affections to the interests and the welfare of this great nation." On the 11th Josephine appeared in public with Napoleon for the last time, at a fête given at the Château of Grosbois by Marshal Berthier, Prince de Neufchâtel et de Wagram. This fine residence had belonged before the Revolution to the Comte de Provence, and later to Barras and Moreau. The kings and princes then in Paris, and a large part of the court, were present. There was a hunt during the day, followed in the evening by a dinner, a spectacle, and a ball. The evening was marred by a most unfortunate contretemps. Berthier had arranged to entertain his guests with a comedy played by Brunet, one of the most popular actors of the day. Brunet, who was entirely ignorant of the coming event, chose from his répertoire a very droll little play which turned on the subject of divorce. Imagine the embarrassment, the stupefaction of poor Berthier, and the feelings of Napoleon and Josephine, when the actor announced his intention of securing a divorce, pour avoir des ancêtres, to have ancestors, followed by a change of mind with the sage remark, "I know what my wife is, I do not know what the one I take may be like." This scene of comedy in the drama of divorce was worthy of the pen of a Shakespeare. Truth is stranger than fiction. 28. 1809. The divorce. Prince Eugène arrived in Paris on the 8th of December. At the time he left Milan he was still ignorant of the reasons for his summons, but Hortense, by order of the Emperor, met him at Nemours, a few miles south of Fontainebleau, and broke the sad news. Josephine had looked forward to his arrival with the hope that he might turn the Emperor from his purpose, even at the last moment; but this illusion was soon dissipated. The position of Eugène was very difficult. He was devoted to his mother, but he owed everything to the Emperor. It was not easy to reconcile his feeling of filial tenderness with the respect and the gratitude which bound him to Napoleon. At his first interview he saw that the divorce was no longer an open question, and that it would be useless for him to raise any objections. He demanded the permission of the Emperor to retire to private life, saying that he could no longer hold the office of Viceroy when his mother had ceased to be Empress; to which the Emperor replied, "Do you not realize how imperious are the reasons which force me to take this step? If Heaven grants me the object of my dearest hopes, the son so necessary to me, who will take my place by his side when I am absent? Who will be to him a father if I die? Who will bring him up? Who will make a man of him?" In order to settle the matter definitely without any further delay, Eugène asked the Emperor to consent to a meeting with Josephine, where in his presence they could have a final explanation. Napoleon agreed, and the conference was held that same evening. The Emperor stated that the divorce was an absolute necessity for the stability of the Empire. Josephine in turn said that this consideration should outweigh any others, and that she was ready to make this sacrifice for her country. Then she added, bursting into tears, "As soon as we are separated, my children will be forgotten. Make Eugène King of Italy." Eugène interrupted her with the indignant words, "No, I pray you, leave me out of the question. Your son does not wish for a crown, which would be the price of your separation. If you bow to the wishes of the Emperor, it is of you alone that he must think." Napoleon was touched. "That is Eugène's true heart," he said. "He does well to trust to my affection." Friday, the 15th of December, 1809, was the day chosen by the Emperor for the dissolution of his civil marriage. The family council assembled at 9 o'clock in the evening at the Tuileries in the salon of the Emperor on the first floor, between the throne room and the Gallery of Diana. All the members of the family were present except Joseph, who was in Spain, Lucien, who was still in disgrace, and Eliza, who was expecting a child. But Madame Mere, Louis, Jérôme and his wife, Pauline, Caroline and her husband Murat were there, together with Eugène and his sister as representatives of the Beauharnais. Cambacérès, the Arch-Chancellor, and Regnault, the Secretary of State, were also present. The palace was brilliantly illuminated, as on days of fête, and the whole imperial family was in full court dress. Josephine wore a perfectly plain white robe, with no jewels. Although very pale, she seemed calmer than either Eugène or Hortense, who were much agitated. Around the room were arranged the seats for the members of the family, in due order of precedence. Armchairs for the Emperor, Empress, and Madame Mere, chairs for the kings and queens, and stools for the others. When all had taken their places, the Emperor arose and began to read this address: "The policy of my monarchy, the interests and the needs of my people, which have constantly guided my actions, demand that after myself, I leave to children, heirs of my love for my people, this throne upon which Providence has placed me. Nevertheless, for several years past, I have lost the hope of having children of my marriage with my well-loved spouse, the Empress Josephine. It is this which has led me to sacrifice the dearest affection of my heart, to listen only to the welfare of the state, and to desire the dissolution of our marriage. Arrived at the age of 40 years, I can conceive the hope of living long enough to bring up in my spirit and my thought the children whom it may please Providence to give me. God knows how much such a resolution has cost my heart; but there is no sacrifice above my courage, when it is proved to me that it is for the benefit of France." The address of the Emperor had been carefully prepared and written out in advance, but departing now from the text, he continued: "Far from ever having had to complain, I can, on the contrary, only rejoice over the affection and tenderness of my well-loved spouse. She has graced 15 years of my life, and the memory of this will remain ever stamped upon my heart. She was crowned by my hand. I desire that she shall keep the rank and title of crowned Empress, but, above all, that she shall never doubt my feelings, and that she shall have me always as her best and dearest friend." It was now the turn of Josephine to speak. She also had modified the terms of the declaration prepared for her, which by its excessive adulation would have taken from her lips a tone of irony. The words which she used were well chosen, and apparently her own, as they were written in her clear hand upon her usual paper. Once more she had given proof of that tact which was one of her graces and her charms. But she had only read a few sentences when her voice became choked with tears, and she handed the paper to Regnault, who continued the discourse. "With the permission of our august and dear spouse, I declare that, since I have no hope of bearing children who can satisfy the requirements of his policy and the interests of France, it is my pleasure to give him the greatest proof of attachment and devotion which was ever given on earth. I owe all to his bounty. It was his hand which crowned me, and seated me on this throne. I have received nothing but proofs of affection and love from the French people. I am recognizing all this, I believe, in consenting to the dissolution of a marriage which is now an obstacle to the welfare of France, and deprives her of the good fortune of being ruled one day by the descendants of a great man, plainly raised up by Providence to remove the ill effects of a terrible revolution, and to set up again the altar, the throne, and the social order. But the dissolution of my marriage will make no change in the sentiments of my heart. The Emperor will always have in me his best friend. I know how much this act, which is made necessary by his policy and by such great interests, has wounded his heart; but we shall win glory, both of us, by the sacrifice which we have made in the interests of our country." Not only her children, Eugène and Hortense, but even the hostile Bonapartes were moved by these eloquent and touching words. The meeting ended with the signature by each member of the imperial family of the document prepared by Cambacérès. The Emperor then conducted Josephine to her apartment, where he left her after a tender embrace. But the night was not to end for Napoleon without one more painful scene. He had hardly retired when the door opened and Josephine appeared. She threw herself into his arms, and Napoleon pressed her to his heart, saying, "Come, my good Josephine, be more reasonable. Courage, courage! I shall always be thy friend." The following day Josephine was to leave the Tuileries forever. After a sleepless night she was occupied from early morning with her preparations for departure. Her children were with her, but Eugène was obliged to leave her at 11 o'clock for the meeting of the Senate, where the decree was to be passed annulling the imperial marriage. It was the first appearance of the Viceroy in his quality of senator. After taking his oath of office, he spoke in support of the resolution offered by Comte Regnault, saying, "I think that it is my duty, under the present circumstances, to make plain the sentiments by which my family is animated. My mother, my sister, and myself, we owe everything to the Emperor. To us he has been a real father. At all times he will find in us devoted children and submissive subjects. It is important for the welfare of France that the founder of this fourth dynasty shall grow old surrounded by direct heirs, who shall be our guarantee as a pledge of the country's glory. When my mother was crowned before the whole nation by the hands of her august spouse, she contracted the obligation to sacrifice all her affections to the interests of France. She has filled this first of her duties with courage, nobility, and dignity." Of the 87 senators present, all but 7 voted in favor of the decree, with 4 blank bulletins. Attention was called to the fact, often forgotten, that no less than 13 of the predecessors of Napoleon upon the throne of France had been constrained to dissolve their marriage bonds, and among them 4 of the monarchs the most admired and loved by the people: Charlemagne, Philippe Augustus, Louis XII., and Henry IV. The first act of the programme, the annulment of the civil marriage, had been carried out, and no obstacle had been encountered. All of the actors had filled their rôles better than any one could have expected. There remained the religious marriage to dissolve, a very necessary step if the Emperor were to espouse a Catholic princess. While the chamber of the Senate was still echoing with the adulations of the address unanimously voted to her by the members, the Empress was leaving the Tuileries. It had been arranged that during the course of the day Josephine should go to Malmaison, which in the future was to be her principal residence, while the Emperor was to depart for the Trianon. He was to leave first at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. When his carriage was announced he took his hat, called to his secretary, Meneval, to follow him, and rapidly descended the private staircase which led to the apartment of Josephine in the rez-de-chaussée. On the entrance of the Emperor, Josephine, who was awaiting him alone, threw herself into his arms, and Napoleon tenderly embraced her. Then she fainted, and Meneval rang for her attendants. As soon as Napoleon saw that she was recovering consciousness, to avoid a prolongation of the painful scene, he took his departure. Enjoining upon his secretary not to leave the Empress, he passed through the salons on the ground floor to the court, and entered his carriage which bore him away to Versailles. When Josephine perceived that the Emperor had left, she seized the hands of M. de Meneval and exclaimed, "Tell the Emperor not to forget me. Assure him of my undying affection. Promise me to send me news of him as soon as you arrive at the Trianon, and see that he writes me." It was now the turn of Josephine to leave. All the members of the palace household had gathered in the vestibule to salute the Empress as she departed. She was loved and regretted by all, and many eyes were filled with tears. To her they had always gone in their troubles, when there was a favor to ask, or a fault to be pardoned. There was not one who did not regard the good Empress as a guardian angel. For the last time, Josephine enters her carriage at the door of the Tuileries, and leaves this abode of 10 years, where she has spent so many happy days, and also endured so many hours of anguish. Cambacérès, who had the matter in charge, found great and unexpected difficulties in procuring the annulment of the religious marriage, and a whole month passed before the decree was published. The ground taken was that the Emperor had been constrained, that his consent had been neither voluntary nor free, and that under the circumstances the marriage was null and void. The facts could not be disputed, but matrimonial cases of sovereigns were by usage reserved for the Pope. It was before the Supreme Pontiff that the cases of Louis XII. And Henry IV. Had been taken. Now the domains of the Church had been annexed to the Empire, and Napoleon had been excommunicated by the Pope, who was at present his prisoner. Other means must therefore be sought for the dissolution of the marriage. The various steps are related in detail by M. Masson, to whom the curious reader is referred. Suffice it here to state that on the 14th of January, 1810, the Moniteur announced to France and to the entire world the rupture of the spiritual bond which united His Majesty the Emperor Napoleon and Her Majesty the Empress Josephine. For several weeks the divorce was naturally the one topic of discussion in Paris. Josephine was an object of universal sympathy, and on descending from the throne as if she were already dead, she was accorded all the virtues. In the army the divorce was generally regretted. With the soldiers she had long been legendary, and many of the officers also attributed to her a beneficent effect upon the fortunes of Napoleon. When the hour of defeat sounded, during the terrible retreat from Moscow, more than one of the old grognards were heard to exclaim, "The little corporal should never have given up La Vieille (the old woman). She brought good fortune to him and to us too." It is doubtful if Josephine would have been entirely pleased with this compliment if she had overheard it. Beugnot, in his Mémoires, also speaks of the general belief that Josephine brought good luck to her husband. "I repeated it, and I even almost believed it," he writes, "that Josephine was the good fortune of the Emperor, and consequently of France, and that if she were ever separated from her husband, she would carry that fortune with her." Josephine, with her Creole tendency to superstition, probably believed it, and certainly tried to make Napoleon believe it. Later on, when overcome by reverses and betrayals, he was heard to say, "She was right. Our separation has brought me misfortune." End of chapters 27 and 28.